I'll never forget the day George came into our lives. Laura and I had been married for 2 years, and we were ready to start our family. When we found out Laura was pregnant, it felt like everything was falling into place. The day George was born was a whirlwind of emotions. Holding him for the first time, I was overwhelmed with love and a fierce protectiveness I'd never experienced before. We named him after my dad. It felt right, like a way to connect my past with our future. "He's perfect," Laura whispered, cradling our son. I couldn't agree more. The next few years flew by in a blur of firsts. First steps, first words, first day of school. Every milestone felt like a victory, and Laura and I reveled in being parents. Our house was always full of noise. George's laughter, the pitter-patter of little feet, and the occasional tantrum. But even on the tough days, I wouldn't have traded it for anything. We threw ourselves into George's life completely. I coached his little league team, and Laura never missed a school play. We'd sit in the audience, beaming with pride as George delivered his lines or made a great catch. Those moments made all the sleepless nights and diaper changes worth it. One winter, we decided to take a family vacation. It was perfect. Snowball fights, hot chocolate by the fire, and George's eyes lighting up at the sight of his first proper snowman. I felt like the luckiest man alive. Then, on our last day, my phone rang. It was HQ, calling me in for a TUI assignment in Chicago. My heart sank. I didn't want to leave my family, but I knew it was part of the job. "I have to go," I told Laura, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. She nodded, understanding but clearly upset. "We'll miss you." I knelt down to George's level. "Hey buddy, Daddy has to go away for work for a little while, but I promise I'll bring you back something special, okay?" George's lower lip trembled, but he nodded bravely. "Okay, Daddy." As I packed my bags, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. "It's just 2 weeks," I told myself. What could possibly go wrong? I kissed Laura goodbye, holding her a little longer than usual. Then I scooped up George, breathing in his familiar scent. "Be good for Mommy," I said, ruffling his hair. As I walked out the door, I turned back for one last look. Laura and George stood in the doorway, waving. The picture of my perfect family. I had no idea then how much everything was about to change. I couldn't wait to get home. The assignment in Chicago had been grueling, but thoughts of Laura and George kept me going. I'd managed to wrap things up early, catching the red-eye back to surprise them. As I pulled into our driveway, the pre-dawn sky was just beginning to lighten. I grabbed the bouquet of roses I'd picked up at the all-night grocery store and quietly let myself in. The house was silent. Everyone still asleep. I crept up the stairs, my heart racing with anticipation. I imagined Laura's face lighting up when she saw me. Maybe George would wake up and we could all have breakfast together. But as I approached our bedroom, I heard noises. Muffled voices, rustling sheets. My stomach dropped. "No," I whispered, frozen in place. "It can't be." I pushed open the door. The scene that greeted me felt like a punch to the gut. Laura, my wife, the mother of my child, was in our bed with 2 men. Their naked bodies were tangled together, oblivious to my presence. The flowers fell from my hand. "What the—" I roared. They jerked apart, startled. Laura's eyes went wide with shock and terror. "Tim, you're home early," she stammered. Without thinking, I lunged at the first man, tackled him off the bed. We hit the floor hard, and I straddled him, raining down blow after blow. "You bastards!" I roared, my voice barely recognizable. The man's face quickly became a bloody mess under my assault. I heard Laura screaming in the background, but it was distant, like it was coming from another room. The second man tried to pull me off, but I whirled around, my elbow connecting solidly with his jaw. He stumbled back, giving me the opening I needed. I sprang to my feet, my military training taking over. The second man charged at me, but I was ready. I sidestepped his clumsy attack and drove my knee into his stomach. As he doubled over, gasping for air, I grabbed the back of his head and brought it down hard on my rising knee. There was a sickening crunch as his nose shattered. "Tim, stop, please." Laura's desperate pleas fell on deaf ears. I turned back to the first man, who was trying to crawl away. Grabbing him by the ankle, I dragged him back. He rolled over, hands raised in surrender, but I was beyond reason. I straddled him again, my fists pummeling his face and body relentlessly. "This is my home," I screeched between punches. "My wife, my family." Each word was punctuated by another blow. Blood splattered on my knuckles, on my shirt, on the carpet. The man stopped resisting, but I couldn't stop. Years of military discipline crumbled in the face of this betrayal. The second man made a feeble attempt to intervene, but I kicked out, catching him in the chest. He fell back, wheezing and clutching his ribs. I turned my attention back to the first man, grabbing him by the shirt and slamming his head against the floor. "Get out," I roared, finally releasing him. "Both of you, get the hell out of my house." The two men, bloodied and broken, scrambled to gather their clothes. They stumbled out of the room, leaving a trail of blood drops on the floor. I heard the front door slam shut, and then silence fell over the house. I stood there, chest heaving, my hands shaking. The rage that had consumed me began to ebb, leaving behind a hollow that threatened to swallow me whole. I looked at Laura, still huddled on the bed, tears streaming down her face. "Tim, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't bear to look at her. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out the front door. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, bringing me back to reality. My hands were throbbing, knuckles split and bloody. I fumbled in my pocket for my cigarettes, desperate for something familiar, something to ground me. It took several attempts to light one with my shaking hands. I inhaled deeply, the smoke burning my lungs. As I exhaled, I looked down at myself. My shirt was spattered with blood, my hands a mess of cuts and bruises. The enormity of what just happened began to sink in. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me feeling hollow and sick. I couldn't go back inside. Not yet. Not yet. Not with Laura still in there. "Get out," I growled, my voice barely recognizable. "Pack your things and get out of my house." I heard shuffling, muffled sobs. I didn't care. I couldn't look at her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw. I shook my head, trying to clear the images. Hours passed. I don't know how long I stood out there, chain smoking until my throat was raw. When I finally went back inside, the house was quiet, empty. Laura was gone. I collapsed onto the couch, my body aching, my knuckles swollen and bruised. Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with nightmares. The next week was a blur. I focused on George, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for him. But everything felt wrong, off-kilter. Then the summons arrived. I stared at the official-looking envelope, my stomach dropping. Assault charges. Of course, those men had the nerve to press charges after what they'd done. I knew I'd crossed a line. The red haze of rage had consumed me, and I'd let my training take over. But the thought of facing legal consequences on top of everything else, it was almost too much. But I wasn't about to roll over. I had evidence of Laura's infidelity. Pictures, videos, texts I wish I'd never seen, but now they might be my saving grace. I hired a lawyer, a no-nonsense woman who didn't flinch when I laid out the whole ugly story. We prepared my defense, gathering every scrap of evidence we could. The day of the trial arrived. I stood before the judge, my heart pounding. I recounted that night, my voice steady even as my insides churned. "Your Honor, I know my actions were extreme, but I came home to find my wife, the mother of my child, in bed with two strangers in our home, where our son sleeps." I presented the evidence, pictures, videos, text messages, proof of Laura's betrayal laid bare for the court to see. It felt like reopening the wound, but I pushed through. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice was grave. "Ms. Thompson, while I understand the emotional distress you were under, violence is never the answer. Your military background makes your actions even more concerning. However, given the circumstances and your lack of prior offenses, I'm sentencing you to 3 months in prison." 3 months. It could have been worse. I knew that. But as they led me away, all I could think about was George. What would happen to him now? Prison wasn't just a cage. It was a crucible where my rage burned hotter than ever. 3 months might not sound like much, but those walls closed in fast, suffocating. I spent my days working out, keeping my body as sharp as my mind. Nights became a battlefield of thoughts, each one a piece in the elaborate puzzle of my revenge. Everything started with a pen and a scrap of paper. I made a list, a detailed plan to dismantle the lives of Laura and those two men. I couldn't let their betrayal slide by. I had to strip them bare as they had done to me. Laura's face, full of fear and regret, lingered in my mind, a constant fuel to the fire already raging within. I kept to myself mostly, sharing no words, just carrying on as though every day was a calculated move in a grand game. Some talked about redemption, finding peace, but not me. My mind, my soul was twisted around the singular mission of retribution. I knew when I got out, I'd have to hit fast and hard. Let the fallout consume them. Release day arrived like a storm breaking. I walked out of those gates with nothing but my plan, a raging tempest hidden beneath a calm facade. I didn't head home. I went straight to a motel. My house, our house, wasn't a home anymore, just a crime scene of trust shattered. First things first, I had enough savings to cover a private investigator. I needed validation to ensure that Laura wasn't just some one-time cheat but a serial betrayer. The investigator confirmed it. More evidence, more fuel to my inferno. Laura's life was littered with moments of deceit. I hadn't even been suspected. Perfect. I knew precisely where to aim next. I gathered the most damning evidence. Photos, texts, even a video. This was my arsenal. I spent nights imagining the look on her parents' faces, the families of those men. It had to be timed with military precision. One hit right after the other. I compiled everything into neat, incriminating packages and sent them out. One package to Laura's parents, another to each of the men's spouses. It didn't take long for the firestorm to ignite. News spreads fast in tight-knit communities. Laura's once perfect, held-together life began to unravel, thread by thread. My phone blew up. Laura's parents called endlessly. Voicemails filled with despair and disbelief. I ignored them, only keeping my focus on the fallout I had crafted. On a Tuesday morning, barely a week after my release, Laura herself knocked on my motel door. Her eyes swollen and red, told a story of sleepless nights and endless turmoil. "Tim, please, you have to stop this," she pleaded, voice cracking. I leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Should have thought about that before you brought them into our bed." I was weak. I made a mistake. But this, destroying everyone's lives. George doesn't need this. I cut her off, stepping back. This isn't about George. This is about you paying for what you did, you and those bastards. She dissolved into sobs there in the hallway. Another proof of my win. I slammed the door shut, feeling a fleeting, twisted satisfaction. This was only the beginning. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I stared at the mountain of documents spread across the table. I couldn't believe how far I'd fallen from the stable life I used to know. The betrayal cut deep, but the fight wasn't over. I was going to make sure George stayed with me, away from that mess Laura had dragged us into. "Tim, you've got a strong case here," my lawyer, Linda, reassured me, her tone professional but empathetic. She was a shark in the courtroom, another weapon in my arsenal. The evidence is spotless. The judge won't take kindly to Laura's actions. I nodded, trying to steady my breath. I just want this over. George deserves better. My hands clenched into fists, knuckles turning white. "Let's go through the custody and asset claims again," she said, flipping through the pages. Precision is key. The days turned into weeks. The legal battle gnawed at my nerves, but I held strong. Every hearing, I laid out the betrayal, the impact on George, the broken trust. Laura tried to put up a fight, painting herself as a victim of her own impulses. But I countered with every shred of evidence I had meticulously gathered. She had detonated the bomb in our lives. I was just there to clean up the debris and ensure George wouldn't grow up in a war zone. In court, I watched Laura fidgeting, looking pale and worn out. Her lawyer droned on about her good character, her lapse in judgment. It was all noise compared to the cold, hard facts. I maintained eye contact with the judge, emphasizing every piece of evidence, every tear George had shed, every sleepless night I'd spent planning. This isn't just about infidelity, I told the judge, voice firm, intense. It's about moral decay, about what's best for George. He needs stability, not chaos. It wasn't just Laura who was on trial. The men, her conspirators, felt the heat too. I had sent their lives spiraling as well, their families once tight-knit now splintered and scattered. The courtroom became a battlefield of broken alliances and exposed secrets. On the day of the final verdict, I sat there, heart pounding. George's picture was in my pocket, a constant reminder of what I was fighting for. The judge flipped through his notes, face stern and unreadable. The court finds that Mr. Tim Thompson has presented a compelling case for the custody of the minor George Thompson. Given the mother's actions and the resultant unstable environment, it's in the child's best interest to be placed under the father's full custody. My heart nearly exploded. Relief, gratitude, a sense of justice flooded through me. But there was more. The court also acknowledges the financial and emotional damage inflicted upon Mr. Thompson due to Mrs. Laura Thompson's actions. Hence, a significant portion of Mrs. Thompson's assets shall be transferred to Mr. Thompson as restitution. Laura's face crumbled. She sobbed, trying to appeal, but the judge's decision was final. The echo of the gavel sounded like a liberation bell. I stood up, every muscle in my body suddenly lighter. The nightmare wasn't over, but this was a massive step towards putting the pieces back together. Outside the courtroom, Laura approached, eyes swollen from crying. "Tim, please, this will destroy me," she whispered. "Laura," I said, voice cold. "It already has. But George, he will be safe and away from all of this. You did this, not me." She fell silent, her sob catching in her throat. I turned, leaving her behind, focusing on what lay ahead. Rebuilding a life that Laura had smashed apart. Meeting George that evening, I scooped him into my arms, his little fingers grasping at my collar. He didn't fully understand what had happened, but he sensed the change. I promised myself to shield him from as much pain as possible and to be his rock, his protector. The house felt empty without the shadow of conflict. It was just George and me, moving forward, bit by bit, piece by piece. Healing. The legal victory was a crucial step. It gave me the leverage I needed to reset our lives. And while my heart still bore the scars from the battle, it beat with renewed purpose. For George, for my parents' memory, for a future that meant something more than betrayal and bitterness. As I put George to bed that night, his small voice asked, "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" I kissed his forehead, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yes, buddy, we are. We finally are." I sat on the couch in our living room, staring at the wall where family photos once hung. The blank spaces mocked me, reminders of the life we'd lost. George was upstairs asleep in his room, blissfully unaware of the storm that had torn our family apart. The house felt different now, empty, colder. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant hum of traffic outside. I ran my hand over my face, feeling the stubble that had grown unchecked over the past few days. "What now?" I muttered to myself. The words hung in the air, unanswered. The court victory should have felt like a triumph. I'd won custody of George, secured our future financially, and exacted my revenge on Laura. But as I sat there in the quiet house, all I felt was a gnawing emptiness. I thought about George sleeping peacefully upstairs. He was innocent in all of this, yet he'd suffer the consequences. No mother to tuck him in at night, to kiss his scraped knees, to cheer at his school plays. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, threatening to crush me under its mass. Standing up, I made my way to George's room. I pushed the door open gently, careful not to wake him. Moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating his small form under the covers. I approached his bed, my footsteps muffled by the carpet. George stirred slightly as I sat on the edge of his bed. I reached out, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "I'm sorry, buddy," I whispered. My voice was barely audible. "I'm so sorry." In that moment, looking at my son's peaceful face, I made a silent vow. I would rebuild our lives, piece by piece if necessary. I'd create a home filled with love and stability, even if it was just the two of us. The scars of betrayal and the bitterness of revenge would be mine to bear alone. As I sat there watching George sleep, I began to plan. We'd need new routines, new traditions. I'd have to learn to be both mother and father, to balance work and home life in a way I'd never had to before. It would be hard, but looking at George, I knew it would be worth it.